Hello, everyone. I'm Mark McCord. Welcome to Some Stops Along the Way, the podcast that highlights some of the most interesting countries in the world through the lens of my work there, but also focuses on their history, culture, and geopolitics. And we're going to continue today with the fascinating country of Saudi Arabia. In our last episode, we talked about the history of the country. I shared some of my experiences there. We talked about the influence of oil in religion, in Saudi culture. And today we're going to pick up with a natural extension of all of that. And that is the foundational element on which Saudi Arabia was built. And that, of course, is the House of Saud. For all the geopolitical storms swirling around Saudi Arabia, the most important political institution in the kingdom has always been the same: the House of Saud. A family that began as tribal leaders in the central plateau of Najd and grew into one of the most powerful dynasties in the modern world. But power in Saudi Arabia is not just about titles, it's about relationships. Those relationships between brothers, cousins, clerics, tribes, and now increasingly young and old. For most of the kingdom's history, the House of Saud ruled through a kind of internal consensus. After Ibn Saud's death in 1953, and if you remember, we talked quite a bit about Ibn Saud in the last episode, the throne passed not from the father to the son, which is common in most monarchies, but from brother to brother, moving through the sons of the founder. This system created stability, but it also created complexity. Every prince had his own network of supporters, his own alliances, his own vision for the kingdom. Decisions were made through negotiation, persuasion, and sometimes quiet rivalry. The royal court was less a palace and more of a political ecosystem where balance mattered more than speed. Saudi Arabia's political system has long relied on patronage. And of course, this is natural in a dynasty that is very family centric. Patronage is critical. But when we talk about patronage in Saudi Arabia, we're not necessarily talking about it in the corrupt sense, but in the traditional Arabian sense of mutual obligation. The royal family distributes wealth, positions, and influence. In return, tribes, business leaders, and regional elites offer loyalty and stability. It's a system that mirrors the desert ethos. Relationships are currency, and trust is everything. But as the kingdom of Saudi Arabia grew, as cities expanded, as the population exploded, and especially as oil wealth reshaped society, the old system began to strain. A modern state requires modern institutions, ministries, bureaucracies, long-term planning, and yet the kingdom still relied heavily on personal relationships and informal networks. This created a tension at the heart of Saudi governance. As I said in the last episode, they started asking a lot of really difficult questions of themselves and of those who were loyal to them. Some of those questions were: how do you modernize without weakening the family's authority? How to build institutions without undermining tradition? How does one maintain loyalty and unity in a family with thousands of princes? These questions became more urgent as the older generation of Ibn Saud's sons aged and as the new generation of younger princes began to rise. You see, for all its wealth and influence, the House of Saud has faced moments of real vulnerability. We talked in the last episode about 1979, which was a seminal year for Saudi Arabia because, on one hand, The government of Iran shifted from the Shah, which was more of a secular government, to a very theocratic government of Shia Muslims under Ayatollah Khomeini. Also in 1979, the Grand Mosque was seized, and that especially shook the kingdom's confidence. Also, the 1990 Iraqi invasion of Kuwait forced Saudi Arabia to host foreign troops, a deeply controversial decision. The rise of extremist groups like Al Qaeda were responsible for horrific violence and human rights violations, and that challenged the kingdom from within. Each crisis exposed the delicate balance the royal family had to maintain: religious legitimacy, political authority, and social stability. In the early 2000s, it was clear that the old model, slow, consensus driven, cautious approaches, were no longer enough. The kingdom needed a new generation of leadership, a new vision, a new pace. And that shift would come in the form of a young prince whose rise would reshape Saudi Arabia more dramatically than any leader since Ibn Saud himself. But before we get to him, we have to understand the moment that forced the kingdom to confront its vulnerabilities, a moment that changed Saudi Arabia's relationship with the world and with itself. And of course, that moment was September 11th. The attacks of 9/11 were a tragedy that shook the entire world. They were also the turning point for Saudi Arabia, a moment of reckoning, reflection, and profound internal change. Because when 15 of the hijackers were identified, they were Saudi citizens. The kingdom could no longer ignore the forces of extremism that had taken root within parts of its society. The next chapter of the Saudi story would be defined by that reckoning. Let's think back. September 11th, 2001, a day when virtually everyone I know can tell you exactly where they were. If they were an adult by that time, virtually everyone knows where they were on that day and how that day and that evening unfolded. Debbie and I were in Romania on September 11th, 2001, and had a huge outpouring of sympathy and support from our Romanian friends and colleagues. But it was a day that changed the world. And it changed Saudi Arabia in ways that were deep, painful, and lasting. The attacks were carried out by Al Qaeda, a violent extremist organization responsible for horrific acts of terror, mass casualties, widespread human rights violations, you name it. Their actions brought devastation not only to the United States, but to countless communities across the Middle East and beyond. For Saudi Arabia, the shock of 9/11 was immediate and personal. As I said, 15 of the 19 hijackers were Saudi citizens. That fact alone forced the kingdom to take a hard look at how extremism had taken root in society. In the days after the attacks, the world asked a question the Saudis themselves were asking quietly and painfully. How did this happen? The answer was complicated, and it remains complicated to this day. You see, 9/11 was created by a mix of ideology, geopolitics, and unintended consequences of decades of religious conservation and regional conflict. But the kingdom could not ignore the reality that some of the extremist ideas fueling groups like Al Qaeda had taken root inside its own society. And for a country built on stability, loyalty, and religious legitimacy, this was a crisis that struck at the core of Saudi Arabia's very identity. Saudi Arabia responded with a seriousness that surprised many outside observers. The kingdom launched one of the most extensive counter-extremism campaigns in the region, a campaign that combined security operations with ideological confrontation. There were arrests, raids, intelligence operations. But there was also something more subtle, and that was a battle for the soul of the country. Clerics were challenged, curricula were revised, sermons were monitored. The government began promoting a more moderate interpretation of Islam, one that emphasized obedience of the state, rejection of violence, and the importance of social cohesion. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't always consistent, but it was a real response to the debacle of 9/11. What many people outside of the region forget is that Saudi Arabia itself became a target of extremist violence. Between 2003 and 2006, Al Qaeda carried out a series of attacks inside the kingdom: bombings, shootings, assaults on residential compounds. Civilians were killed, police officers were killed, foreign workers were killed. The kingdom realized that extremism wasn't just a foreign policy problem, it was a domestic threat. It was a threat that could tear apart the country from within, which was unacceptable to a monarchy that was used to stability. The years after 9/11 were some of the most difficult in the US Saudi relationship. Trust was shaken, public opinion hardened, politicians questioned the partnership, but behind the scenes, cooperation deepened. Saudi intelligence became a critical partner in counterterrorism efforts. Information shared by the kingdom helped prevent attacks, and joint operations disrupted networks. Quiet diplomacy rebuilt bridges. It was a reminder that geopolitics is rarely simple, and that even strained partnerships can endure when interests align. So 9/11 marked a new beginning of a generational shift inside of Saudi Arabia. Younger Saudis, more connected to the world, more educated, more aware of global perceptions, began pushing for change. They wanted a country that was modern, open, and forward looking. They wanted opportunities beyond government jobs. They wanted a society that could compete in the global economy. And the leadership in the House of Saud knew it. The kingdom's old model, conservative, cautious, slow to change, was no longer sustainable. Something new was coming: a new pace, a new vision, a new kind of leadership. And that leadership would arrive in the form of a young prince whose rise would transform Saudi Arabia more dramatically than any figure in its recent history. His name was Mohammed bin Salman, known in Saudi Arabia, by foreigners at least, as MBS. A prince who would challenge the old order, centralize power, and launch most ambitious reforms in the kingdom's history. MBS was a prince who would redefine Saudi Arabia's identity and its place in the world. Every generation in Saudi Arabia is a force of its own, and every generation has a defining figure. For the founding generation, it was Ibn Saud. For the oil boom generation, it was King Faisal. For the modern era, the era of globalization, technology, and rapid change, that figure is MBS. His rise was swift, dramatic, and unlike anything the kingdom had seen in decades. MBS was born in 1985, and he represents the new Saudi Arabia: young, ambitious, impatient with old constraints. When King Salman ascended the throne in 2015, he elevated his son rapidly. First to Minister of Defense, then to Deputy Crown Prince, and finally in 2017 to Crown Prince, replacing his older cousin. It was a break with traditional consensus-driven model of succession. It signaled that the kingdom was entering a new era, one where speed mattered more than caution, and where the old guard would no longer dictate the pace of change. In 2016, MBS unveiled Vision 2030, the most ambitious reform package in Saudi history. Its goals were sweeping: diversify the economy beyond oil, create a vibrant private sector, expand tourism and entertainment, empower women, modernize education, build futuristic cities like Neom, and attract global investment. I'm very pleased to have played a role in the implementation of Vision 2030. First within the Saudi Arabia General Investment Authority, and later within the the Saudi Competitiveness Agency, both under the direct or tacit leadership of Dr. Iman al-Mathuri. My team and I were very much involved in the diversification of the economy beyond oil. We were very much involved in helping create this vibrant private sector. We helped write the tourism law that opened Saudi Arabia for tourists from all over the world, and that began things like sports tourism, which is so prevalent now, and entertainment tourism. We were somewhat involved in the modernization of education as well, and very much involved in the attraction of global investment. So many of the main elements of 2030 were very much connected to what my team and I were doing in advising the Saudi government. This Vision 2030 was designed to build a strong economy, but also reduce dependence on government jobs. It was a plan that said, in essence, Saudi Arabia's image must change or be left behind. Under MBS, Saudi society began changing at a pace that would have really been unthinkable even a decade earlier. As I said in the last episode of the podcast, while I was there, women were granted the right to drive. Cinemas reopened after 35 years. Because of that tourism law and the impetus behind entertainment tourism, concerts, sporting events, and festivals filled the calendar. Tourist visas became available to visitors from around the world. Religious police, for the first time, saw their powers curtailed. For a country long defined by strict and social norms, these changes were seismic. They created excitement, opportunity, and for many Saudis, a sense of possibility. I will say, though, that perceptions matter a great deal to the Saudis. And the perception of these changes, in my opinion, sometimes overwhelmed the reality. As I said, I was working in Saudi Arabia during this time. And yes, women were granted the right to drive for the first time. Did many of them do it? No. Were those that did under a very high level of scrutiny and somewhat harassed? Yes. So these reforms, if you will, were trumpeted around the world. But below the surface, there was still this conservative element in Saudi Arabia, especially within religious circles, that muted the effect, at least the initial effect, of those reforms. MBS's rise also came with the consolidation of authority, unprecedented in modern Saudi history. He restructured ministries, sidelined rivals, and brought key institutions, security, economy, and defense, under his direct control. In 2017, the Ritz-Carlton and anti-corruption purge, where dozens of princes and businessmen were detained, sent a clear message. The old rules were gone. The new order had arrived. Now, I was in Saudi during this period, first doing short-term assignments and then going there to live. And I will say that from a foreigner's perspective, we all appreciated the anti corruption purge. But it was a running joke that these princes, high level government officials who were purged during this time were quote unquote put in jail at the Ritz Carlton Hotel until they repaid the money that they had stolen. I'll say that again. They were put under house arrest in the Ritz Carlton Hotel. Only in Saudi Arabia could something like that happen. I can't think of another place in the world where that could happen. And so, once again, what the world saw was the first major anti corruption purge in the recent history of Saudi Arabia. But in actuality, at least some of it was rather cosmetic. Even so, the message was clear that the rules of the game were changing because of MBS. Supporters saw it necessary to change these rules, a long overdue cleanup of corruption and inefficiency. But critics saw it as a power play. Either way, it reshaped the political landscape. But then a big crisis hit. MBS is very, and continues to be very adept at creating the kind of visibility in Saudi Arabia that is very controlled and very standard across the board. Because perception, as I said before, matters to the Saudis. But the Khashoggi crisis exposed all of that. And you can't have a discussion about MBS without acknowledging the killing of journalist Jamal Khashoggi in 2018. This happened just before I arrived in Saudi Arabia for my long-term assignment. Khashoggi's murder was a horrific act that drew global condemnation and raised serious concerns about human rights and political repression. The incident damaged Saudi Arabia's international reputation, it strained relations with Western partners, and it remains one of the darkest chapters in MBS's tenure. And a reminder that rapid modernization has come with profound controversy. So, for those of you who may not be totally aware of the Khashoggi crisis, let me give you a brief background. In October 2018, the Saudi reform narrative collided with one of the darkest moments in the kingdom's modern history. Jamal Khashoggi, a Saudi journalist living in self-imposed exile and writing critically about the government, walked into the Saudi consulate in Istanbul, Turkey, to obtain paperwork for his upcoming marriage. He never walked out of that consulate. What happened inside the building became a global crisis. Turkish authorities released audio and surveillance footage and intelligence assessments indicating that Khashoggi had been killed by a team of Saudi operatives. The details were grim, the implications even more so. For a kingdom trying to present itself as modern, open, and reform-minded under MBS, the incident struck like a lightning bolt. International outrage was immediate. Western governments demanded answers. Human rights organizations condemned the killing. The CIA assessed that the operation was likely approved at a high level of Saudi leadership, though Saudi officials denied that the crown prince ordered the killing. The kingdom eventually acknowledged that Khashoggi had been killed, calling it a rogue operation carried on without authorization. But the damage was done. The crisis reshaped global perceptions of Saudi Arabia. Investors paused, diplomats recalibrated. Critics argued that the incident revealed the darker edges of the kingdom's rapid centralization of power. Supporters countered that MBS remained essential to the country's modernization and stability. Inside Saudi Arabia, life continued. Reforms pressed forward, mega projects expanded, the society kept changing. But outside, the Khashoggi crisis became a defining moment in the world's understanding of the kingdom under MBS. A reminder that modernization and political control were unfolding side by side, sometimes in tension, sometimes in conflict. It was a moment that forced the world and the kingdom to confront the complexities of Saudi Arabia's transformation. As I said, I was working in Saudi at this time, and it was a subject that was not discussed, that you did not discuss. As a matter of fact, I saw a World Bank consultant kicked out of the ministry one day for even bringing it up. Khashoggi was a forbidden topic inside the country, especially for those expats like myself who were working there. We put our heads down. We focused on implementing Vision 2030, and we let the Khashoggi issue play out the way that it played out. But it was certainly a time of tension and a time for a lot of questions, both coming from outside of the country and quietly from inside of the country as well. What more can we say about MBS? Well, he embodies a paradox that defines today's Saudi Arabia. Rapid social liberalization paired with tight political control, economic openness paired with limited dissent, ambitious reform paired with assertive centralization. MBS is a leader determined to transform the kingdom, but on his terms. Despite these controversies, and despite the debacle with Khashoggi, MBS remains popular among many young Saudis, a demographic that makes up more than 60% of the population. They see him as a leader who understands their aspirations, which are jobs, opportunity, global connection, a more open society, and a future not tied solely to oil. For them, MBS represents momentum, a break from stagnation, a chance to redefine what it means to be Saudi in the 21st century. Under MBS, Saudi Arabia is no longer content to be quiet. They're no longer content to be a cautious actor. Today's Saudi Arabia is assertive, ambitious, and eager to shape the region and the world in new ways. But to understand the full impact of MBS's leadership, we have to look beyond domestic reforms, because the most dramatic changes may be in the kingdom's geopolitical strategy, its rivalry with Iran, its role in OPEC, its relationship with the United States, and its relationship with emerging partners such as China and Russia. Saudi Arabia today is not just transforming itself, it's repositioning itself in a rapidly changing Middle East. And that brings us to the heart of modern Saudi, a story of a geopolitical landscape that defines the kingdom's ambitions, its anxieties, and its future. A landscape shaped by rivalry, alliances, energy, and the shifting balance of power in the Middle East. Geopolitics in Saudi Arabia is an enigma wrapped in a riddle. It is extremely complex. But if you want to understand the Middle East today, you have to understand Saudi Arabia's place in it. The kingdom is no longer a quiet actor. As I said before, it's a megaphone. It is determined to be the nexus of power in the Middle East. And the center of this new geopolitical posture lies on one simple truth. Saudi Arabia is redefining what it means to be a regional power. And of course, you can't talk about Saudi as a regional power without talking about its relationship with Iran. For decades, the defining political rivalry in the region has been this conflict between Saudi Arabia and Iran. It's not just a political competition, it's ideological, it's religious, and it's civilizational. Saudi Arabia sees itself as a leader of the Sunni Muslim world, the guardian of Islam's holiest sites and the defender of the traditional Arab order. Iran sees itself as a vanguard of a revolutionary Shia movement, challenging Western influence and supporting militias and political movements across the region. The two countries back opposing sides in conflicts from Yemen to Syria to Lebanon to Iraq and to Bahrain. It's a rivalry fought through proxies, diplomacy, and influence rather than directly. But always, the conflict is intense. Let's look at the Yemen war as an example. In 2015, Saudi Arabia launched a military intervention into Yemen, aiming to push back the Houthi movement, a group aligned with Iran. What was expected to be a short campaign became a long, grinding conflict with devastating humanitarian consequences. The war strained Saudi's resources, drew international criticism, and exposed the limits of military power in a region where local dynamics often outweighed intervention. For Saudi Arabia, Yemen became less of a complex regional conflict rather than reshaping a neighbor's politics through force. Even today, this conflict between Iran and Saudi Arabia not only exists, it's taken even a more acute form with the United States and Israel's recent attack on Iran, which debilitated its military hierarchy. Of course, the Saudis, although somewhat caught up in this themselves, aligned with the United States, and Iran saw that as provocation and began firing missiles not just at Saudi Arabia, but other countries in the region as well, including Jordan and the United Arab Emirates and Qatar. So once again, Saudi and under MBS rule finds itself in an overt conflict with Iran. There's no love lost there. And I'm sure there are many people within the Saudi government who would love to see the regime in Iran fall, but maybe for a different reason than the United States and Israel. If Iran falls, that leaves the Sunni Islam government of Saudi Arabia to be one of the strongest in the Middle East, and it galvanizes its position as a leader in the Middle East without the distraction of Iran's Shia sect. Energy still remains the backbone of Saudi influence, but the kingdom is no longer a singular actor. In 2016, it formed the OPEC Plus alliance, a coalition that includes Russia, a partnership that reshaped global oil markets. This alliance gives Saudi Arabia greater leverage over global prices, a strategic relationship with Moscow, and a counterweight to U.S. pressure. It also signals a broader shift. Saudi Arabia is diversifying its global partnerships. A strong ally of the United States for many years, the OPEC Plus move somewhat shifts that balance of allegiance. Speaking of the United States, the partnership between the U.S. and Saudi Arabia has always been a marriage of interests, not of values. Oil for security, stability for access, cooperation for influence. But in recent years, the relationship has become more complicated. U.S. energy independence has reduced the reliance of America on Saudi oil. Human rights concerns created political friction. The Khashoggi killing strained the trust between the two countries, and U.S. policy toward Iran shifted across administrations. And yet, the partnership continues to endure because both sides need each other. It's a partnership of convenience, if you will. Saudi Arabia continues to need security guarantees and advanced technology. The United States needs regional stability and counterterrorism cooperation. It's a relationship being renegotiated, not abandoned. China has now emerged too on the radar in terms of Saudi Arabia's geopolitics. As the U.S. recalibrates its role in the Middle East, China has stepped in with a different approach. No political conditions, heavy investment, technology partnerships, energy deals, and diplomatic engagement. This is a page out of China's playbook around the world. And it's been very successful. China is now Saudi Arabia's largest trading partner. It even brokered the 2023 Saudi-Iran reapproachment, a diplomatic moment that signaled a new era. For Saudi Arabia, China offers opportunity. For the United States, it raises questions. For the region, it marks a shift toward multipolarity. The 2020 Abraham Accords also highlighted a reshaping of the region by normalizing relations between Israel and several Arab states. Saudi Arabia did not join, but it quietly supported the process. Today, normalization between Saudi Arabia and Israel remains a possibility, but one tied to Palestinian statehood discussions, security guarantees from the United States, regional stability, and domestic political considerations. If it happens, it would be one of the most significant diplomatic shifts in Middle Eastern history. Saudi Arabia's positioning in the world also makes it quite interesting in terms of everything from global diplomacy to economics. The country sits at a crossroads of global trade routes: the Red Sea, the Gulf, and the Strait of Hormuz. These waterways carry a significant portion of the world's oil and commercial goods. This geography gives the kingdom strategic leverage, security vulnerabilities, and a central role in regional maritime stability. Recent attacks on shipping, including those by the Houthi movement, underscored how fragile these routes can be. And now we see, with what is happening in the Strait of Hormuz, this additional element of fragility when it comes to movement of goods, not only by the Saudis, but the major powers of the world through those waterways. So the Middle East today is no longer defined solely by old alliances or Cold War dynamics. It's shaped by things like youth demographics, technology, climate pressures, economic diversification, shifting global powers, and regional diplomacy. Saudi Arabia is positioning itself not just as a participant in the new Middle East, but as one of its architects. It's a country trying to balance tradition and transformation, religion and reform, and sovereignty and globalization. A country that knows the world is changing and is determined not to be left behind. And under MBS leadership, I can virtually guarantee that it will not be left behind. But geopolitics is only half the story. To understand Saudi Arabia today, you have to understand its people, their hopes, their frustrations, their daily lives. Because beneath the skyscrapers and strategy papers, there's a society undergoing one of the most rapid transformations in the world. For all the headlines about oil, geopolitics, and royal intrigue, The real Saudi Arabia today is founded on its people, a society that's, as I said before, is young, ambitious, and undergoing a huge transformation. If you want to understand the kingdom's future, don't look at the palaces or ministries. Look at the streets of Riyadh on a Thursday night. Look at the cafes in Jeddah. Look at the universities in Dhahran. Look at the young women walking into offices that were closed to them just a decade ago. And I worked with many talented young women in both Sagia and the competitiveness agency. And as I said, those were headed by a woman, Dr. Iman Al-Mathari. At its very core, Saudi Arabia is changing, not from the top down, but from the bottom up. As I said, more than 60% of Saudis are under the age of 30. This is a generation that grew up with smartphones, social media, global culture, and a sense of possibilities that their parents never had. They're connected to the world in ways that would have been unimaginable even 20 years ago. They watch Korean dramas, follow American influencers, listen to Egyptian pop, and debate Premier League football with the passion of lifelong fans. Many of the young Saudis that I worked with in both Sagia and the competitiveness agency they loved rock and roll, they loved hip hop, especially rap music. They absolutely loved stand-up comedy. I was actually on an airplane leaving Saudi on a trip in, I believe it was 2018, might have been early 2019. And Run DMC was on the plane. They just performed in Saudi and happened to be on the flight out with me. That is just an example of how Saudi has changed. And I learned a lot from the young Saudis, both men and women, who have a different outlook as to what they want their country to be. And they see MBS as the guide to get them there. These young people want opportunity. They want dignity. They want a future that feels open, not predetermined. And they're the ones who are pushing the kingdom forward simply by being who they are. As I alluded before, the role of women in Saudi Arabia has changed a great deal. In fact, it's perhaps one of the most visible transformations in Saudi society. Women now drive, they work at banks, they work at hotels, they work at law firms, they work at government ministries, they attend concerts and sporting events, they travel more freely, they start businesses, they study abroad. These things didn't erase the kingdom's conservative roots, but they opened doors that had been closed for generations. For many Saudi women, the shift is not just about rights, it's about identity. It's about being seen. It's about being part of the national story. Saudi's cities are changing as well. In fact, they're changing at a pace that almost feels cinematic. Riyadh is becoming a global metropolis, a city of glass towers, tech hubs, and sprawling districts. Jeddah remains the kingdom's cultural heart, artistic, diverse, and deeply connected to the Red Sea. Neom, the futuristic mega project in the northwest, represents the kingdom's most ambitious attempt to build a city of the future from scratch. And my team and I were somewhat involved in the Neom planning, and it is going to be an amazing success story for Saudi Arabia. But these projects aren't just about architecture, they're about psychology, about showing Saudis that the future can be built, not just inherited. And one example of this is this shift in culture, entertainment, and the new sphere of public life. You see, for decades, Saudi Arabia had almost no public entertainment, no cinemas, no concerts, no festivals. Social life happened in private homes, not in public spaces. But today, thanks to, in some part, to the to my team that worked both within Sagia and then with the competitiveness agency, the legal framework was put in place to open Saudi Arabia up to the world as far as tourism and culture go. Now they have Formula One races, international concerts, film festivals, comic conventions, food expos, sporting events, cultural celebrations. The public sphere is open, and with it, a new sense of community. One of the biggest things that we've seen, especially if you love golf, is the LIV Golf Tour, which rivaled the PGA Tour and created a lot of angst around the world. If you've been reading the news, you know that very recently the Saudis announced that they would no longer, after 2026, they would no longer fund the LIV Golf Tour. Some say that it's because they've had to realign their priorities because of lagging oil sales and because they're spending so much money now on defense because of the issues that are going on in the Middle East, especially with Iran. But those of us who worked in Saudi and have seen a little bit behind the curtain realize that the Saudis like to move on to the next big thing. Golf was huge for them and will remain important. Formula One, the same way. But they always want to be at the cutting edge. And so they tend to dabble in things and then move on to something even better. So I was not surprised that they started the LIV Golf Tour with huge fanfare, and now they're exiting it with very little fanfare. It's not something that that was expected, evidently, by those on the LIV tour, but something that could have been totally predicted by those of us who have worked with the Saudis. And that's not a criticism. They're making a business decision. They made a business decision to start the tour. They're making a business decision to get out. And that shows how far they've come in being able to make those type of decisions. But even with all these changes, tension is bubbled under the surface. As a matter of fact, we know that rapid change always brings tension, right? Some Saudis worry that the pace is too fast. Others worry it's not fast enough. Some fear the loss of tradition, while others fear the return of stagnation. So MBS is trying to balance modernization and identity, openness and control, youthful ambition and conservative values. Wow, it's a delicate dance, and one that requires constant adjustment. The Saudis aren't always going to get it right, but it won't be because they didn't try to get it right. They're always going to be very sensitive to perception. They're always going to be very sensitive to criticism because they are a very proud people and they want to be positioned in the world in a way that gives them maximum influence. So looking forward, despite the challenges, there's a sense of momentum in Saudi today. A feeling that the country is moving, sometimes awkwardly, sometimes boldly, but I guarantee that it's moving forward. Young Saudis talk about careers in tech, tourism, and entertainment, and even entrepreneurship. They talk about travel, education, and opportunity. They talk about a future with a confidence that would have been rare a generation ago. And in their voices, you can hear the sound of a country that's reinventing itself. But even as Saudi Arabia transforms socially and economically, one question looms over everything. What happens when the oil runs out or when the world no longer needs it? The future of the kingdom depends on how it answers that question. And Vision 2030 addressed it head on because, as I said before, a lot of the work that, in fact, all of the work that my team did and that other consultants are doing right now across Saudi Arabia is focused on increasing and enhancing the competitiveness of non-petroleum sectors. So the House of Saud, and specifically MBS, realizes that oil may not last forever. And that therefore the demand for oil may not last forever. So the country really stands at a crossroads. It's a moment of profound possibility and profound uncertainty. The kingdom has more wealth, more ambition, more global influence than at any point in its history. But it also faces a challenge that no amount of oil, no skyscrapers, no single leader can solve alone. The future of Saudi Arabia will be shaped by 5 forces: economics, energy, climate, geopolitics, and identity. When we look at this question of what happens if the oil runs out, or what happens if the world moves away from fossil fuel as the main generator of productivity. Well, for decades, Saudi Arabia's prosperity has rested on this single resource. The world's changing, though. Renewable energy is rising, electric vehicles are spreading, climate concerns are reshaping global policy, and the Saudi leaders know this. As I said, it was a big part of why Vision 2030 came to bear. So they know the oil era will not last forever, which is why they want to focus on things like tourism, technology, logistics, entertainment, manufacturing, renewable energy, mining, and finance. Things that even 20 years ago would, if not have been scoffed at, certainly de-emphasized. So the question is not whether Saudi Arabia can diversify, it's whether it can do it fast enough. And that's what we were doing when I was there. We were moving at warp speed. And Dr. Mathuri made sure that we were moving quickly because she was under pressure to deliver these reforms quickly. And so the teams that worked with her and for her had to be the same way. Let's talk about climate for a moment. We already know that Saudi Arabia is one of the hottest countries on earth. I can attest to that fact, believe me. Climate change will even make it hotter, if you can believe that. Water scarcity is a looming challenge. Rising temperatures threaten agriculture, infrastructure, and public health. And that's why today the kingdom is investing so heavily in solar power, green hydrogen, carbon capture, water desalination, and environmental restoration. But the scale of the challenge is absolutely enormous. The desert's beautiful, but it's all-consuming and it's unforgiving. As for geopolitics, as I said previously, the Middle East is entering a multipolar era. The United States remains a key partner, but China's rising, Russia's present, regional powers like Turkey, Iran, and the UAE are asserting themselves. Saudi Arabia wants to be that anchor of this new order, the stabilizing force, a diplomatic broker, a hub for investment and innovation. But leadership comes with a risk. So the kingdom must navigate things like Iran's ambitions, as we've already discussed, the evolving role of Israel, Yemen's instability, tensions in the Red Sea, shifting alliances, and the great competition for power. The future of the Middle East will not be shaped by one country, as we've already determined. But the Saudis want to be at the table. And if possible, they want to be at the head of the table. So, what happens next? Well, what happens next depends a lot on the monarchy. And even in terms of the monarchy, they're asking the same question: what happens next? MBS is young, energetic, and deeply involved in the kingdom's transformation. But the long term stability of Saudi Arabia depends on building institutions that can outlast a leader. And that's another thing that my team did virtually on a daily basis, is try to build strong institutions. Strong leaders come and go, but strong institutions that are well governed and guided by rule of law remain as guiding forces in the society. So the future will require stronger governance, transparent institutions, a more diversified economy, and a political system that can adapt to a young, connected population. The House of Saud has survived for nearly 300 years by adapting. The next adaptation may be the most important at all. Because the most hopeful part of Saudi Arabia's future is not found in the oil fields anymore. It's in mega projects. It's and the biggest mega project of all, I would argue, is not bricks and mortar. In Saudi, on a daily basis, you hear all this talk about mega projects like NEOM and others. But the biggest mega project in Saudi Arabia has always been, and it still is, its people, especially its youth. They're educated, they're connected, they're ambitious, they're proud of their heritage, but they're eager for the world. They want Saudi to be a confident, modern, and open country, but still unmistakably Saudi. And in their aspirations, you can see the outline of the kingdom's future. It's a future that's going to have to balance its tradition and innovation, religion and reform, sovereignty and globalization, and stability and change. But if there's one thing the kingdom's always understood, it's this: survival in the desert requires adaptation. Thriving in the desert requires vision. And certainly MBS and Vision 2030 exhibit that. The question is how it will use them. How will the Saudi leadership use this vision? So we return to where we began, to that morning in Riyadh when I stood on the 10th floor of the Marriott Executive Lounge and looked out into a sandstorm rolling across the city. It's a metaphor for the kingdom itself that's caught between ancient and modern. Because the story of Saudi Arabia is not just a story of oil, politics, or religion. It's a story of people and place, a land shaped by the desert, and a nation determined to shape its own future. When I think back to that morning in Riyadh, to that sandstorm rolling in without warning, with the city disappearing behind a curtain of dust, I realize now that it was more than just weather. As I said, it was a metaphor for the kingdom itself. Saudi Arabia is a place where clarity can vanish in an instant, where the horizon shifts, where the familiar becomes obscure, where the desert reminds you that nothing there is permanent. Not the storms, not the calm, not even the certainties you carry with you when you arrive. As my driver and I made our way through that storm years ago, the world outside the windshield was reduced to shapes and shadows. The towers of Riyadh, symbols of ambition and modernity, were swallowed by the same sand that shaped the Bedouin for centuries. It struck me then, and it strikes me now, that Saudi Arabia lives in that tension between what it has been and what it hopes to become. A nation built on ancient traditions, now racing toward a future of megacities, green hydrogen, and global influence. A society rooted in faith, navigating the pressures of modern life. a monarchy balancing continuity with transformation, a people who carry the desert in their bones, even as they step into the world of technology and possibility. Saudi Arabia is not simple. There's nothing simple about it. One of the most complicated places I've ever worked. It's not static. It's not easily understood from a distance. It's a place of contradictions and of remarkable resilience. You see, the desert teaches patience. Oil taught power. The modern world demands adaptation. And the kingdom is trying in its own way to honor all three. As the sandstorm eased that morning and the outlines of the city slowly reappeared, I remember feeling something unexpected. Not a frustration, not fatigue, but a kind of respect. A respect for a place that refuses to be defined by a single narrative. A respect for a people who have learned to live with uncertainty. Respect for a nation that understands, perhaps better than most, that survival is not about resisting change, but about navigating it. Saudi Arabia is still writing its own story. It's wrestling with its identity. It's still shaping its future, one decision, one reform, one generation at a time. And like that storm, the kingdom moves in ways that are sometimes sudden, sometimes overwhelming, sometimes beautiful, sometimes even irrational, sometimes maddening, but always consequential. As I stepped out of the car that morning, sand still clinging to my clothes, I looked back at the city emerging from the haze. Riyadh was waking up again, not just from the storm, but from a century of transformation. And I realized at that moment something simple and something true. To understand Saudi Arabia, you have to understand the desert. To understand its future, you have to understand its people. And to understand its story, you have to be willing to sit in the storm and watch the horizon change. And I am so blessed that I was able to do that. I hope you've enjoyed these 2 episodes on Saudi Arabia. Tune in next time when we're going to jump into another very interesting country in the Middle East. Until then, have a great week.